A spooky New England fishing village plagued by ghost ships, a historic Texan shoreline lurked by the spirits of those killed in massive disasters, and a Pacific Northwestern coastal region where a terrifying ghostly mummy roams await on this list of some of the most haunted beaches in the United States. Let's dive right in. Hey guys, and thanks for joining me on this adventure to find the US's most haunted beaches. Boasting over 95,000 miles of shoreline, the United States offers some of the more wildly diverse and unique beachfronts on our planet. But behind every pleasure pier, amidst each harbor, and across the very oceans themselves, many of our most cherished coastlines hide chilling ghostly secrets, and stories of encounters with the supernatural that linger beneath the sands just off the beaten path. Are you ready to get started? Our first haunt takes us along the coast of Maine to the historic and mysterious Bar Harbor. Bar Harbor, which is located on Mount Desert Island in Hancock County in Maine, is quite literally your classic sleepy, often foggy, and rather creepy New England coast town that's bounds are tied to fables of old and tales of encounters with the paranormal. Historically, while for thousands of years tribes native to the region, and namely the Wabanaki, would frequent Mount Desert Island, it wasn't until the late 1700s when they were sent to reservations that lingering remnants of these tribes took refuge here. In 1761, Abraham Solms would establish the area's first European settlement and would call it what else but Solmsville. In 1796, the community that formed where Bar Harbor now sits would be established as Eden after the English statesman Sir Richard Eden, and the locale's economy would rapidly develop in areas such as fishing, lumber, shipbuilding, and both agriculture and dairy. Through the 1840s, Eden's rugged maritime scenery would pull in members from the Hudson River School and Luminism artists, and following a slew of prominent pieces, sportsmen, nature enthusiasts, rusticators, and researchers would follow. By 1880, the harbor would boast 30 hotels. Over the years, tourists would flock to the area, and on March 3rd of 1918, Eden was re-established as Bar Harbor. Sadly, in 1947, a large fire would heavily damage the locale, though reconstruction efforts would be swift, and over the decades, the town would continue to grow while retaining its rustic, seafaring nature. In the present, Bar Harbor remains a popular tourist destination and boasts a range of small shops, picturesque lodgings, scenic nature expanses, and various points of interest. Now, while we could probably do an entire upload on the town of Bar Harbor itself for this next part, I'm going to try to keep things isolated to the surrounding coastlines and waters, so here it goes. Over its lengthy existence, Bar Harbor has earned a rather ominous reputation as a hotspot of the supernatural, and those who have frequented its shores have reported disembodied music heard drifting on the winds, sightings of inhuman creatures that skirt the nearby forests, and instances of personal electronics dying even on full charges. A handful of ghost ships have been sighted silently skirting the waters, especially on foggy nights. Chillingly, those who have encountered these spectral vessels have reported feeling threatened, or as if they're in some sort of danger, and those aboard their own boats or ships have recounted engines dying spontaneously, leaving them stranded as these phantom behemoths circle them slowly. Several informal investigations of the beachfront have yielded high EMF levels, chilling EVPs, and hits on communicative devices such as spirit boxes, and reports from a handful of local youths who have taken to exploring the harbor after dark as a rite of passage, have described encounters with full-bodied apparitions in clothing spanning the eras, and run-ins with a variety of cryptid-like beasts that lurk in the mists. And on to number 2, which has us traveling just out of Los Angeles, California, and onto the iconic Balboa Island. Balboa Island, which is surrounded by the city of Newport Beach in Orange County, California, is a beautiful harborside community boasting a number of quaint restaurants, shops, docks, and a long history of ties to supernatural activity. Historically, predating development, lands now holding Balboa Island were nothing more than sprawling mudflats. Through the 1860s, brothers James and Robert McFadden would purchase, divvy up, and start selling a bulk of the area now containing Newport. Over subsequent years, the site would become an essential harbor point, and through the late 1800s, and following the creation of McFadden Wharf, Newport would act as a booming shipping center and company town. After which, in 1902, James McFadden would sell off a majority of associated lands, including a region in the swamp that had grown to be known as Balboa Peninsula, to W.S. Collins and C.A. Hansen. Incidentally, Collins and Hansen would see Newport's potential as a resort town, pushing through the early 1900s for the implementation of Pacific Electric red cars. And in 1906, Collins would have a dredge built and would begin dredging the channel that now forms Newport Bay, while simultaneously creating Balboa Island. While initially the island would grow pretty slowly, in 1912 a bridge to the expanse was constructed. In 1916, the community was declared part of the city of Newport Beach. In 1920, gas utilities would be added, and in 1929 a new concrete bridge was completed, after which Balboa's population would absolutely boom. More recently, through the 1950s, roadways on the island were all paved. In 1981, the old concrete bridge was replaced by a new one that toted 9-foot wide walks. And into more modern times, Balboa has grown into a lush and vibrant community, sporting a range of landmarks, historic homes, and events each year. In 2016, Balboa would celebrate its centennial, only further bolstering its renown and recognition. In the present, this spit remains open to the public and totes what is actually considered one of the most expensive real estate markets in North America, aside from Lower Manhattan, with lot values sitting at around just over $2 million, and simple 2-bedroom houses costing double that. And while they certainly are up there, according to long-standing local legends, the housing prices aren't the only scary thing on Balboa. And all along its shorelines, both residents and visitors have reported disembodied voices heard on the winds, odd cold patches felt through the normally balmy California heat, and instances of vehicles or boats stalling out or refusing to start. Some claim the lands that held the former Balboa Peninsula were significant to native tribes, and possibly once held a burial ground. Incidentally, it's believed that the disruption of this burial ground has caused unrest amongst the local spirits, or has even resulted in a curse, and some tell the whole of the area has been imparted with bad luck that can sometimes result in injury, death, or even the loss of one's fortune. Informal investigations of the beach have yielded high EMF levels and strange hits on thermal grids, while those who have dared to tread its bounds after dark have described encounters with shadowy figures that lurk about, and that have even chased several who have crossed their paths. Lastly, easily the most famous story associated with Balboa Island's beaches is tied to a 1993 incident in which 2 boys who were swimming near were caught in a riptide, resulting in their deaths. To date, and especially at night, many have reported sighting 2 figures in the waters splashing around and calling for help. And though many have either contacted the authorities or even jumped in their own boats in attempts to save these manifestations, upon closing distance, these figures always seem to disappear into thin air at the last moment, leaving the blackening waters calm and bearing no signs of their troubled, otherworldly existence. Our third haunt has us combing one of the few beaches in Texas, being that of the historic Galveston Beach. Galveston Beach, which is located in none other than Galveston, Texas, is a popular coastal expanse toting a historic boardwalk and pleasure pier alongside a number of prominent attractions. Its bounds have seemingly always been tied to old sea fables and chilling ghost stories. Historically, for thousands of years, the island now holding Galveston was initially frequented by a number of tribes native to the region, most prominently by the Karankawa, up until European expansion began. Notably, in as early as 1528, Cabeza de Vaca and his crew would shipwreck on an island referred to as Isla de Malhado, though it's unknown if this documentation pertains to Galveston or possibly to San Luis Island. Much later, in 1785, Spanish explorer José de Evia, who was working under orders of Bernardo de Galvez, would refer to the island as that of Galveztown. By 1816, the island toted the starts of permanent settlement. By 1825, Mexico would establish the port of Galveston, and in 1836, the blooming community would act as the capital of the Republic of Texas. Through the Civil War, in 1863, the Battle of Galveston would transpire, in which Confederate forces would expel Union troops occupying the township. Following the war, and through the late 1800s, Galveston would tote a large African-American populace comprised namely of freed slaves and some men who were freed before the war. And by the end of the 19th century, the island was recognized as one of the nation's largest cotton ports, and even closely competed with New Orleans. Sadly, in 1900, Galveston was struck by a massive hurricane, which still actually holds the record as the United States' deadliest natural disaster, with a fatality total of around 8,000 people, and it resulted in the construction and implementation of various preventative measures. Through the 1920s and 30s, the city would boom as a popular tourist destination, and through the 1930s and 40s, the region would be transformed amidst the fires of World War II, when the Galveston Municipal Airport, which was the predecessor to the Shoals International Airport, was redesignated as a U.S. Army Air Corps base. Following WW2, the island would flourish as a popular gaming city. However, the growth of Las Vegas would draw crowds from Texas and into Nevada. And in 1957, the Texas Attorney General would launch a massive campaign against gambling and prostitution on Galveston, preceding which, the area's economy would fall stagnant for a time. Similarly to the turn of the century, but on a much smaller scale, in 1961, Galveston was once again rocked by a hurricane, resulting in 800 deaths. Through the remainder of the 60s, the city would welcome the establishment of a maritime academy and Galveston College. And more recently, by the early 2000s, local property values would rise as various expensive projects were completed. Sadly, once again in 2008, Galveston would weather another massive storm, being Hurricane Ike, which caused extensive damages, and following which, the city would focus on investments in tourism and shipping, higher education, and the addition of the Galveston Island Historic Pleasure Pier, which is packed with rides, attractions, fun, and games. But a good time isn't all Galveston Beach has to offer, and over the years, a range of legends regarding local ghostly activity have formed. Not surprisingly, a majority of said fables have to do with the island's various historic hurricanes and all the deaths involved, and many believe the spirits of those who were forced to pass on too soon may still linger. All along the beachfront, both locals and visitors have reported instances of objects moving on their own or going missing entirely, the sounds of strong winds and screaming even on calm days, and instances in which they are suddenly surrounded by ethereal versions of storm victims, often bearing grisly wounds, and seemingly roaming around in confused trances as if they never really fully came to terms with their own deaths. Chillingly, over the nearby waters, a number of ghostly vessels, ranging from pirate ships to more modern constructs, have been known to manifest suddenly, gliding silently over the waters, and those who have encountered them have reported feeling unnerved, as if whatever crew is aboard them is watching with malicious intent. And others claim the ghosts of privateers who buried a treasure somewhere along the beachfront tend to turn up from time to time, in order to guard their fabled loot. Informal investigations of the shoreline have yielded EVPs captured in recordings, strange EMF fluctuations, and orbs caught in photography, while several swimmers have told of feeling as if hands are grabbing at their ankles from the depths in an attempt to pull them under. Lastly, on the Pleasure Pier, multiple reports entail ghostly figures sighted moving about, instances of games operating of their own accord, and accounts of the entire pier coming to life long after closing. Our fourth haunt has us traveling to the oldest city in the US, being St. Augustine, Florida. St. Augustine Beach, which sits where else but in St. Augustine, Florida, is a popular coastal expanse framed by the fascinating history behind what is literally the oldest city in the whole of the United States, and its bounds are also tied to a range of eerie local legends and old hill folklore. Historically, predating European colonization, lands now holding St. Augustine were inhabited by the Timucua people, who hunted and fished locally. In 1513, the area was first charted by Spanish explorer Juan Ponce de Leon, and later, in 1565, the city of St. Augustine was founded under Spanish conquistador Pedro Menendez de Aviles. Through the remainder of the 16th century, St. Augustine would act as an important outpost in protecting Spanish treasure fleets sailing the Gulf Stream back to Europe. It would face a number of conflicts with European rivals including the English, and combined with issues between native tribes, the city would only be allowed to thrive thanks to its strong military fortifications and importance to Spain in the New World. The 17th century would fare little better, as continued resistance from native tribes would inhibit progress. On top of this, privateers were contracted by other nations to attack the community on multiple accounts. And though times were rough, through the construction of Castillo de San Marcos and the establishment of the Franciscan mission system, St. Augie would persevere. Through the turn of the 18th century, the city would hold out against numerous attacks made by the British. Amidst the War of Jenkins's Ear, which lasted from the 1730s through 40s, numerous British assaults would prove futile against the impenetrable Castillo de San Marcos. And following the Treaty of Paris in 1763, Spain would cede Florida to Britain in exchange for Havana for a time, before the Treaty of Paris in 1783 returned it once again to Spanish rule, marking the start of a second Spanish period. Through the start of the 19th century, St. Augustine remained under Spanish rule for a time. However, the nation's grip was weakening. Under the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819, Spain would cede Florida to the U.S. in exchange for currency and claims in Texas. And on July 10th of 1821, U.S. troops would take possession of St. Augie, after which the Seminole people would resist this new leadership, resulting in the Seminole Wars, and in the forced removal of most of the Seminole people. In 1845, Florida was admitted as the 27th state in the Union, just in time for the Civil War, during which time, in 1861, the state would join the Confederacy and would be claimed by the Union only a year later with minimal resistance, and after which it, along with the rest of the South, would face severe struggles as they worked to form a new economy not based off the exploitation of free labor. St. Augustine, however, would see a tremendous growth spurt in the shadow of industrialist Henry Flagler, who established the Ponce de Leon Hotel from 1885 to 88, and in turn, invested into the very infrastructure of the city, transforming it into a desirable tourist destination. More recently, through the turn of the 20th century, St. Augie would continue to welcome increasing numbers of tourists. Through World War II, the city would see a large economic boost as it hosted military outfits from nearby bases. Following the war, the need for preservation of its historic landmarks would arise and further boost tourism to the area. And through the 20th century, it would focus on accommodating modernization while still preserving its historic legacy. In the present, St. Augie is widely renowned as our country's oldest city, and as a travel destination for millions of tourists each year. Not surprisingly, its breathtaking beach has become one of its many focal points. Chillingly, the St. Augustine beach has seemingly always been associated with supernatural encounters and spine-tingling ghost stories, and those who frequent the shoreline report extreme cold patches felt in the normally balmy Floridian weather, old-timey music without source heard drifting on the winds, and after-dark encounters with shadowy manifestations that flit about at unnatural speeds. One haunted hotspot near is said to be the old lighthouse on Anastasia Island, which purportedly plays host to the spirit of a former lightkeeper. Within, many have told of doors opening and closing on their own, of disembodied footsteps heard ascending and descending the tower, and of the smell of tobacco smoke without source. And some have even claimed to have watched as various objects or furniture move around of their own volition. Additionally, the keeper's house is believed to harbor no less than 3 entities, and possibly more, with reconstruction workers through the 1980s reporting sighting a man hanging from the rafters who was there 1 minute and gone the next, a ghostly little girl who they'd often awake to find standing at the feet of their beds, and an unknown presence in the basement that, while never actually sighted, made itself known through strong, ominous vibes or through the moving of various tools or equipment. Additionally, the bodies of 13 executed pirates were buried right behind the old residence, and many have detailed sightings of the apparitions of these men wandering about, some with visibly broken necks. Lastly, several ghost ships have been spotted in waters nearby, and some who have encountered these phantom vessels have described feeling dizzy or panicked, a sensation so intense it's actually caused them to flee the area. Saving the spookiest for last, we're exploring the northern Oregon coast. Now, as some of my longtime viewers know, this listing hits pretty close to home for me as a born and raised Oregonian, and it may at first seem strange that instead of a specific beach, I'm choosing the whole of the northern Oregon coast, but it'll all make sense in a minute. Stretching from Tillamook through Clatsop counties, the northern coastline of Oregon is a lush Pacific Northwestern region dotted with small beach towns, towering forests, and ridiculously beautiful shoreline. But beneath its picturesque setting lies a web of old sea fables, ghost stories, and ancient lore. Historically, predating European settlement of the region, tribes native to the area inhabited the coast for tens of thousands of years, some of which that included the Clatsop, Tillamook, Alsea, Susla, Coos, and Coquille. And because of the locale's plentiful food and generous climate, many of the settlements they formed were indeed permanent ones. Much later, some of the first explorations of this sprawling coastline were led through the 16th century by none other than famous British explorer Sir Francis Drake. In 1774, the first recorded expedition through the region was led under Spaniard Juan José Perez Hernandez, and in light of Hernandez keeping his findings secret, a year later, in 1775, an expedition led by Bruno de Heceta and Juan Francisco de la Bodega y Cuadra would claim the fame of being the first impactful exploration of this coast. Meanwhile, subsequent expeditions through the late 18th century under famous explorers James Cook and George Vancouver would also mark a number of significant discoveries. Now, this next part isn't exactly news, but following the turn of the century, in 1805, the famous Lewis and Clark expedition would reach the northern Oregon coast and would form Fort Clatsop near our present-day town of Astoria. By 1811, fur companies, trade outposts, and settlers would dot the area. Slowly, British claims to the land were lost, and in 1838, one Charles Wilkes would arrive on the coast to raise an American flag. Following Oregon's statehood in 1859 and the completion of railroads through the coastal region, development of this landscape would absolutely take off. Over the years, the locale would profit from industries such as timber and fishing, and in 1870, the first lighthouse at Cape Blanco was constructed, followed closely by the Yaquina Bay and Yaquina Head lights just a year later. Through the remainder of the 1800s, a number of towns including Seaside, Newport, and Rockaway Beach were established. In 1911, Governor Oswald West would begin the process of reclaiming coastal lands for public use. And in 1913, Oregon legislature would declare the entire length of the state's ocean shore as a state highway. Through the remainder of the early 1900s, the Oregon coast would flourish with blossoming communities and tourism. In 1966, and in response to greedy hotel and motel owners, the Oregon Beach Bill would be passed to ensure that even to this day, nearby establishments can't bar off sections of the coast. And into modern times, while the Oregon coastline has since developed, it's managed to keep its towns relatively small and stands as a beacon above its neighboring, crowded, and overdeveloped California coastline counterparts. In the present, the Oregon coast remains a popular destination for tourists due to its plentiful nature opportunities, clean shorelines, endless small shops, luxurious and quaint lodgings, and rather mysterious ambiance. Though, as a third-generation local, I'd feel remiss not mentioning, and with all due respect, that while we welcome your visit, we'd also appreciate if you didn't stay too long. Now, of all the various Oregon coastal regions, perhaps none is more mysterious than its northern portion, of which today we'll be focusing on the stretch from Tillamook and its neighboring beach of Oceanside up through Astoria. Iconically, and I may be a little biased here, but this stretch of coast is easily one of the most beautiful and ominous shorelines in the US. And while it's dotted with beaches and adjacent towns, such as Tillamook, Cannon Beach, Seaside, and Astoria, a good deal of it is also rough, rocky cliffsides framed by dense Oregon wilderness, a mess of trails, and other jaw-dropping features. And all across it, both locals and visitors have reported shadowy figures sighted on roadways along various shores, strange transmissions heard through personal devices and across car radios, and full-bodied apparitions that roam about, and that range from figures in ancient native attire up into more modern garments. Easily one of the most famous stories surrounding the northern Oregon coast ties itself to the Highway 26 overpass, which is at the split right where 26 meets Highway 101, and where, coming from Portland, one can either turn right to Seaside or left to Cannon Beach. Disturbingly, motorists through this area describe instances of a spectral man that leaps from the overpass into the beds of trucks or onto the roofs of cars, and that pounds on said vehicles, terrifying their drivers before fading away. Another famous story has to do with the town of Cannon Beach itself. As it's told, the whole of the beachfront and several main drives through the town are commonly plagued by a ghostly woman in white recognized as the Lady of Cannon Beach. Chillingly, accounts of encounters with this figure span back through the 1980s and possibly even further, and in most instances, witnesses describe sighting this glowing figure drifting about at an unnatural pace before disappearing from the site. One point of interest along this infamous segment of coast is that of the Tillamook Rock Light, or Old Terrible Tilly, as it's more affectionately known. And while many claim the lighthouse itself is haunted by the spirits of former keepers and of those tied to its bounds, many who have worked or stayed within over the years have also reported a far more chilling phenomenon, being a ghostly ship with tattered sails that appears on foggy nights, headed straight for the rock at an alarming speed, but that always vanishes right before a would-be impact. Interestingly enough, some who have witnessed this phantom vessel have claimed it's gotten so close they can actually hear commands being shouted between its spectral crew members, and some suspect this may be the death image of the historic ship, the Lupadia, which crashed near long ago. Out of the whole of the northern Oregon coast, perhaps no area is more infamous than the dreaded Graveyard of the Pacific, which sits at the mouth of the Columbia River, right off of Astoria. The reason for this ominous moniker? Well, since about 1792, over 2,000 vessels and countless lives have been lost through its bounds, and at night, those skirting nearby shorelines have reported screams and voices that drift on the winds, as well as an entire host of ghost ship sightings, ranging from old sailboats to more modern constructs. Lastly, and spanning the entirety of Highway 101 and the paralleling shoreline, one legend has cemented the northern Oregon coast as one of the creepiest haunted destinations on the planet, and that's the fabled story of the dreaded Bandage Man. Now, if you search this tale of terror online, you'll get a lot of conflicting information, so here it is from a local's perspective. Long ago, sometime through the 1950s or earlier, an evil man who was either a murderer, mental patient, or possibly both, was being transported along Highway 101 from somewhere to the south and possibly up to a destination in Washington, when his transport vehicle lost control, ran off the road, and caught fire. Disturbingly, some believe this accident was caused by said man who attacked the driver, and that this incident transpired somewhere near or just to the south of Tillamook. Whatever the case, by the time medical responders arrived, only one person present was still breathing, being our psychopath in question. EMTs would then load this man, who had suffered third-degree burns across nearly 100% of his body, into their rig, where they would wrap him in gauze like some sort of grotesque bloodied mummy, and would then speed northward in an attempt to get him to the nearest hospital. As it's told, the man's injuries were so severe that he died a number of times all along Highway 101, over possibly 75 miles of road, following which, each time, he was revived over and over again by medical personnel, before he finally succumbed to his injuries in or right near Astoria. But his story didn't end there, and it's said that his wicked soul would return to the earth from the afterlife to stalk the entire stretch as the dreaded Bandage Man. As he was at the time of his passing, the Bandage Man appears as a horrifying figure wrapped from head to toe in blood-stained gauze, and the first warning signs that one is in his presence is usually the smell of burned or rotting flesh. The Bandage Man has been sighted all along 101, from just to the south of Tillamook up through Astoria, usually skirting the sides of the roadway or further west along the beaches. Some more terrifying stories detail instances in which campers sitting around fires have witnessed the Bandage Man dart from the darkness through their campsites, growling in a deranged manner before disappearing into the darkness moments later, while other tales tell of beachgoers who have been chased by this murderous manifestation at great lengths. Perhaps the most spine-tingling story surrounding the Bandage Man tells that he likes to sneak into the back seats of moving vehicles, especially those driven by lone motorists, where he'll sit and wait. Incidentally, said motorists are usually only made aware of his presence back there by the foul smell he emits, and as local legend has it, if they look back and meet his gaze, or even catch a glimpse of it in the rearview mirror, that's when the Bandage Man will strike. So it's important for those put in this situation to stare straight forward at the road, and not make any attempts to view this lurking monstrosity until his odor dissipates entirely. Thanks for joining me on this exploration of some of the most haunted beaches in the United States. If you enjoyed hearing my histories and ghost stories, subscribe to my channel, throw this upload a like, and share me with anyone you feel could use a good scare. I'll see you all next time, and safe travels out there.